My PhD kind of came out of a time when I was working with the Sustainability Institute and the Agroecology Academy there, and was, I suppose, reflecting on some of the challenges that we'd been facing around youth and agriculture and learning for that. So I think that's where it had its origins, I suppose, and then kind of grew out of that over quite a few years. And yeah, so maybe if you're kind of thinking about it from that perspective, is that I was somebody who was involved in teaching and learning, had an interest in youth and agriculture, and then this kind of PhD emerged out of that, and is maybe a little bit of a reflection on that as well as a response to some of the challenges that we faced there. So yeah, this is it. Unsi and Scott were my supervisors, and yeah, I'll just kind of run through. So I suppose I'll just go through a bit of the background and context, and then I did my PhD by paper. So I can talk through, just a little bit on each of the three papers, and then, we'll just kind of leave some time for kind of questions and things afterwards. So, yeah. Let's see if this actually works. So I think also from the kind of context perspective, we know that South Africa is a really interesting point in its history around, I think maybe a bit of resurgence around youth and youth movements, many of which are responding to issues that relate to education, kind of the systemic exclusion from education, seen in things like the Fees Must Fall movement, issues around the way that education is designed and conducted, and the kind of content of education and learning, and the whole movement around roads and roads must fall, and the way that relates to curriculum and curriculum design, a kind of renewed effort and push around land and land reform, and a kind of revitalization of that. And I think for me what that sparks is also really, really critical questions around the failings that we've had in terms of equipping land reform, even at the very, very slow pace that it was proceeding at. And if we're then to ramp it up, what does that actually mean for from a capacity perspective? We weren't able to meet the needs of land reform even at a slow pace, and if we're ramping it up, then what then for education? So I think those are also some of the spaces that it was playing into, and really thinking about some of the kind of issues and concerns that were kind of coming up at a national level amongst young people. But I think also to put that, I think sometimes as South Africans we lose perspective on why it seems like so often we're very, very different from many of our neighbors around a lot of these issues. And I think it's obviously a lot of really complex issues and factors feeding into that. But I think for me, one that's quite interesting is just thinking about actually realizing how different South Africa is in terms of the point along our kind of demographic curve that we are at compared to the majority of our neighbors. And I think this really feeds into a lot of the things we're seeing in South Africa. So really just recognizing that by and large our youth bulge has already happened, and now those young people are kind of moving up through the system, and as they do there's a kind of increasing demand for employment, education, and all those other challenges which we're really coming up against at the moment. Whereas the neighboring sub-Saharan African countries by and large are just kind of, their populations are still much younger than ours. And I think that really has really profound implications for employment and for education, amongst many, many other things. So in South Africa, the official unemployment rate around 27% compared to the regional average of around 7.2%. Kind of dramatic differences there. And then kind of looking into particularly around youth unemployment, just radically high levels between kind of 40 and 60% youth unemployment. And I think the reason I mention this is really just to think about also South Africa as something of potentially a canary in the gold mine around the kind of challenges that many, many others might be facing around kind of challenges with youth, as almost 1 billion work seekers enter the job market in Africa over the next kind of 30 years or so, which is a massive number, and only 10% of whom are likely to have any form of tertiary qualification. So for me, this raises a lot of questions. But the big one is, okay, well, to say nothing of maybe the quality of education in terms of green skills or other things that this 10% is receiving, what of the other 90%? And as in some ways, I kind of hope that this work would speak in a very, very small way to some of that too. But just really thinking about how these huge numbers of young people who won't make it to tertiary education can be kind of productively engaged in the kind of making and mending and weaving of the kind of future of this country and continent. So then kind of zooming down another level into the kind of food system. which was a space that I was engaging and working with. In South Africa, agriculture is seen as one of the kind of key engines of job creation and the kind of strategy of the National Development Plan and the youth policy and others. And then really just recognizing that, the agricultural system in South Africa, but also increasingly in other parts of our region, and this photo is actually from Mozambique, a banana plantation in Mozambique, but is trapped between these dual systems, in which there's increasingly little space in this middle zone between this large-scale, increasingly industrialized agricultural systems and the kind of subsistence agricultural sector, and the kind of tensions that emerge as a result of that. So the National Development Plan speaks of creating around 1 million jobs in the agricultural sector and the associated value chains. But at the same time, it also really recognizes that if we're kind of following agricultural expansion in the same way that we have been, we're not going to create these jobs. And indeed, that over the between 2001 and 2016, we lost almost 300,000 jobs, even though the sector was really growing. So it's saying, well, we can't pursue agricultural development in the way that we have, because if we do, we're going to continue to enrich a small number while shedding jobs. So just kind of speaking into that space too, and saying, okay, well, what alternatives exist? And I think for me, which was also really central, was where are young people's voices in this debate? There's a lot of kind of popular wisdom of conventional thought that says, speaks of this kind of paradoxical turn away from agriculture in spite of high levels of unemployment. So young people are turning their backs on agriculture even though there's no jobs elsewhere. So it was saying, well, what's happening there? Is that true? And are there any other things happening behind this which can help us understand that better? And then if there is interest and young people are willing to engage, what alternatives exist for us as educators to draw on in that process? And then at the same time, I think, through our work at the time with the Sustainability Institute and other civil society organizations and farmer organizations around the Western Cape, being aware that despite, these two opposing systems, there were these alternatives. There were farmers who, though few and far between, were managing to make a go of farming agroecologically, organically, in some fringe spaces in and around the city and beyond. And for us, or for me at least, what that really showed was that while these systems were difficult and challenging, they weren't impossible. And that also, there was a lot of potential valuable knowledge that was kind of transformative or transgressive knowledge that was being developed in these spaces of practice that we as educators and educational institutions might need to think more seriously about in terms of thinking about change and how we equip young people and support them into these projections. And I think even like thinking about our work at the Sustainability Institute, we'd found, or at least I'd found at my time there, that it was very often farmers themselves that had the most valuable knowledge, but they didn't have the time to teach. And so there was, we were struggling to find faculty to staff programs who had the right competence and things behind them. So saying, well, how do we get better at drawing knowledge out of that? So the 3 papers then for my thesis was firstly trying to understand those kind of youth narratives and seeking out young people's perspectives on agricultural careers, saying, well, are they even interested? Because that, in my mind, should form the foundation of any efforts forwards. And then if so, kind of trying to map out the learning networks in ways that learning in these niche spaces was taking place and asking whether there were things that we could learn from how people who were succeeding in these spaces were themselves learning. And then thirdly was kind of playing with some methodological approaches for supporting and bridging those two things. Also, if there is interesting experience and knowledge being generated in these spaces and there's interest amongst young people, how do we get better at connecting these without relying on large institutions? And how do we kind of build that process? So I'll speak a little bit to that at the end. Kind of broadly, the kind of literatures that I drew on around youth and livelihoods, education, kind of food systems, and then those bounded, in a sense, in a kind of broader set of literature around systemic transitions. So I took a mixed, as you kind of probably will have guessed by now, kind of quite a mixed methods approach, based on quite an extensive literature review in the beginning. And then for the first paper around youth narratives, using kind of narrative-based approach called Sensemaker, which some of you might be familiar with, that blends qualitative and quantitative information or approaches that allows you to, in some ways, collect micro-narratives on quite a large scale, and then allowing respondents who told you those narratives to self-signify them within a kind of set signification framework. So it's a way of kind of spanning the qualitative and quantitative and working with stories, but on a larger scale. So I had 3 case study sites for that, one in the Western Cape, KwaZulu-Natal and Limpopo, and I'd collected almost 600 stories from young people across these spaces. And then for the second and third papers, using NetMap, which is a network analysis and power mapping tool, to kind of map out these networks, these learning networks. So for the first paper, it was also in a way, I think, one of the first empirical studies into youth attitudes and experiences around agriculture in South Africa, at least on this scale. I think that was one of the main contributions it made. So these are the kind of small fragments or stories that Sensemaker collects that I was probing for, and I selected this one because I think it sums up in many ways the overall message which I found coming out of this. So I was 17 and had put through my university application. I sat down with my parents and told them that I wanted to do farming as one of my career choices. They said no, farming was for old people, and they didn't put me through school to get dirty running after pigs. They want me to do an office job, and I had to choose between my parents' funding and a career. So this is from a young person in Limpopo. And I think what this in some ways speaks to is this, yes, there is that very pervasive negative stigma and pressure around agriculture, which in many ways, from parents' perspectives, you could say is very justified, given how few success stories there have been in the sector and the kind of career options that are out there. So yes, that negative stigma really exists, and there's a lot of pressure on young people to move out of it and not follow it. But also at the same time, that in spite of that strong negative stigma and pressure, there are some young people in this country who really, in spite of all that, are kind of have a calling towards this work and see value in this work in a kind of vocational sense. So I think for me, it was part of what my findings from this was really trying to tease that apart a little bit and develop a little bit more complex understanding of the narratives there. So what Sensemaker allows you to do is to collect these stories and then allow your respondents to then place them within a kind of set framework. So for example, so each of these data points represents a story. And then the kind of question then to some of the respondents is youth like those in your story regard work in agriculture as, in this top corner, a useful stepping stone to something better, a means of survival only, and an exciting career path. So you can then start getting these clusters of stories that relate to particular things and then kind of teasing apart the data in that way. So it'll just give you an idea of some of those. I won't go into those in detail now. And then, there's a whole bunch of other data that you can generate in that process. Kind of saying, okay, well, how do you feel about career decisions? Are they harder than other career choices, or are they the same as making? Because career choices are always difficult. And saying, well, a lot of young people were saying career decisions relating to agriculture are actually probably harder than most other ones. So it's kind of interesting to see. And then, so from that data, then pulling together something of a kind of framework for thinking about the progression of young people into agricultural careers. And I think mainly like looking at the demotivating narratives, or the kind of forces that push people out of those careers, and then the ones that motivate them into it. And I think these stories are the ones that we hear more often around, peer pressure, the kind of recognition of risk, the perception of hard work with very, very low returns, the lack of opportunities, family pressure and scorn. So I think those are the narratives that are very present and are definitely part of the truth in that story. But I think the ones that we don't hear as often are these ones, which is around young people's desire to support their own communities and seeing, work with food production as a really clear means to do that, feeding community and family and country. Youth's desire to start their own businesses and be entrepreneurial, and seeing agriculture as an opportunity through which to do that. A clear awareness of a personal passion and a vocational calling towards work with the land. As well as others that you might expect more around the need for employment and things. So it was just kind of trying to unpack that a little bit, and then thinking a bit more about what youth were experiencing as they moved along this path from their perspective, and what they were lacking, what stopped them. But I won't go into that too much. This paper has been published in Agricon, so if anybody's interested, I can share that. But just in summary, in a sense, on that one, saying that there was substantial interest from from our sample at least, of around 30% of young people who either saw it as a really exciting option or a kind of viable and useful stepping stone onto something better. But in many ways, the missing middle in this space between these two systems left young people feeling trapped between kind of two opposing forms of slavery. One at the hands of the kind of traditional subsistence agricultural sector and the poverty and drudgery they associate with that, and the other in the large-scale commercial agricultural sector, of which 90% of jobs require no more than a matric, and which you're likely to be stuck in a minimum wage position for most of your career. So that lack of a missing middle kind of forces a kind of self-exclusion of youth into the sector. So that was paper one. And then moving on to the second, then saying, okay, well, if there is this interest, and there's a need to kind of find these spaces, these spaces between, what might these look like, and how does learning taking place in these spaces already happen? So the method I used for this was NetMap, which has been used quite widely in a range of other fields and hadn't been used from an educational perspective before. But what I did was I identified farmers who were kind of considered successful in their fields at various scales. And then I, through a participatory kind of mapping process, worked with them to say, well, who are the factors and actors that influence your success? How are you connected to them? What do you exchange? And which of those do you feel are most influential to your success? So it allows you to map it out, and then just using very, very, very simple methods, just using kind of physical counters, them then allocating influence to each of the actors within their own network of influence, or those that influence them. And this was an incredibly interesting exercise because I did it, half of my sample was with farmers themselves, and the other half of the sample was with organizations that were there to support these kinds of farmers. So civil society organizations, government extension services, training institutions, and just seeing how radically different the farmers themselves and the support organizations viewed the same picture. So there were, one of the biggest differences I think which came through was that none of the support organizations mentioned the kind of critical influence which farmers felt that their immediate partners played on their success. So we talk about farming and farmers. Although we had this idea of family farming, the message coming through very, very clearly from farmers was that this is a collective operation, and that the most influential actor to my success is my immediate partner. And I think we very often underestimate how difficult making a go of this kind of farming is in this current kind of market and ecological environment. And I think expecting farmers to be able to master all the skills necessary to a requisite depth in order to get a viable farm to be working is completely unrealistic. So I think there's questions that need to be asked around, well, if one person is focusing on the kind of financial management and the marketing, the distribution of products within the family, and the other is focused more on the production elements, how then do we imagine training for that space? And are we shooting ourselves in the foot by trying to focus on training up farmers rather than farming families, just for example? So those are some of the questions that this tried to tease out. But overall, kind of coming also to a database of around about 340 actors which farmers were working with in the context, and a lot of different connections. Kind of then filtered down to specifically the exchange of information, and kind of gives you for the farmers at least pictures like this, which you're seeing the very important role that from a farmer's perspective input suppliers and private sector actors are playing on their knowledge struggles as pioneering organic farmers, the real value of online sources, other farmers internationally, Google, YouTube, farmers in Canada who've developed their own curriculums there and are sharing those quite freely. And the almost complete absence of any state institutions in those networks. So Boland College was the only one that came through amongst one farmer, and that was in a very, very, very small sense. And I think in some ways it speaks to the informal networks of support that are emerging, and I think also helps us to understand where the kinds of things that are useful and where that competency sits. So kind of in summary of that then, formal training institutions largely absent, but in their place, this informal networks had emerged, pioneers, kind of like the knowledge networks are largely practitioner-led, and that it wasn't formal state institutions and research services that were leading this. So I think those were kind of some of the things that were emerging from that. And I think, so while in some ways it's an indictment on the state services, it also says, well, there's something lacking there. But if we consider how systemic educational exclusion is in South Africa, there's no way that state institutions can do this on their own. And we know that. But I think what this prompts us to think about is maybe some more of the ways that we can get better at building learning networks between state actors and others, how we can maybe get better at supporting or approaching learning from more of an expansive perspective. I think one of the other things which really came out from farmers was the need not to focus on like long courses. And if you look at the way that learning was happening, it was actually in many ways, from a learning theory perspective, quite pedagogically sophisticated in the sense that it was really place-based, it was kind of learner-led, it was very flexible, it was task-orientated or problem-orientated. So a lot of the things that this informal network was doing that was actually from a learning theory perspective was what universities would very often strive to do, but didn't necessarily get right themselves. But that these spaces were severely under-resourced. Those who had the knowledge were farmers, and they were then like feeling an additional burden and pressure then to try and share their knowledge, even though they were working 110% of their time just to get their farm businesses to stay afloat. So saying, how do we get better at supporting those actors who are already working as teachers and supporters in the space to get better? And how do we get better at taking the knowledge that they have and their experience and not making learning around that dependent on their time? So kind of trying to draw some of that stuff out too, which I think my third paper tried to speak to a little bit, which was taking this net map approach and saying, well, how could we turn this into a method that people working in these spaces could use to support learning in these kinds of ways? I skipped a slide. I didn't. Okay. So I showed you the network map of the farmers, the combination of the farmer responses. This is now the one from the sector organization, so much wider, a lot more actors. But just really saying that from one of the findings that came out of that was that this is quite a useful way of being able to surface the kind of latent knowledge and experience that exists within these kind of informal learning networks and undocumented spaces. So kind of bringing it to the surface, so that as someone who's working for a training organization, a college or an civil society organization, you could go into a space around a particular career field, and this happened to be agriculture, but to identify people who were making a go of that and successfully doing that and saying, well, who are the knowledge and what are the knowledge resources that you are drawing on that have been useful to your journey as you've become successful in this, that have helped you master this, and surfacing that and having effectively a method to structure and surface that, because I think often I felt at least that from my perspective, I'm not a farmer, and although I was still trying to design curriculums for farmers, and I found that like a lot of the others who were doing similar things in South Africa were in a similar position. They recognized the importance of what needed to be taught. We had a sense that it was possible because we saw others doing it, but we didn't always have a clear way of knowing what was really needed to be taught, how to teach it. And I think what this helps in some ways to do is to go to people who are succeeding and elicit their input from them. So it's in some ways it's a way of doing kind of a grassroots curriculum scoping or curriculum design process with successful people in the field. So it allows you to surface it and then to validate it. So if a lot of farmers are all saying that one particular resource or particular person knows a lot about compost production or a particular skill, that's a form of peer review and validation that doesn't require you then to go through kind of long processes of research and design. It's a way of kind of quite quickly, I think, getting to understand who has valid knowledge around which topics. Because I think also in these kind of niche spaces, there's a lot of people who often have quite crazy ideas. And those crazy ideas can be quite useful, and it's part of what takes us forward, but it doesn't mean that people's crazy ideas are always true and that they always hold water. And I think very often a part of that experimentation process that takes us forward is that people have these ideas and they fail, but they don't always maybe hold back on sprouting their ideas before they've really tried and tested them. So if everybody in a network is saying that, well, actually this person knows what they're talking about, or I source knowledge from this person on seedlings or whatever, it's a way for you as someone who is then thinking about whose knowledge you can draw on to say, okay, well, this person can be trusted in this process. without needing to take that particular, compost production system through a long kind of research and peer review process. So it's a way of kind of shortcutting that from a peer review perspective. And then I think also kind of providing some structure to when to teach things, but also I think taking this notion of competency beyond something that you know and embedding this idea of competency in a set of relationships and saying that it's almost as important to know who to turn to when you have a problem as to know what the answer to that problem is in the first place. So thinking back to that first image that I'd had of this, where, saying, well, these are the kinds of relationships that for farmers, success seems to require. Farmers who succeed seem to have a relationship with a good seedling producer. They seem to have a relationship, with with a series of online resources and these are the online resources that they've been using to problem solve when they do come across problems, rather than trying to, over the course of 1, 2, 3 years, download a whole lot of information. Rather thinking about structuring a set of relationships and brokering and supporting people to establish relationships when they're embarking on a new kind of career or learning pathway. So it's saying, well, can we think of competency as relational, as an emergent property of relationships, as well as something which you implicitly understand. So then I think it's just touching on some of like the key actors that were useful, and I really like this example. Which was this one farmer in Canada who's had a little bit of support. He's been farming for the last 15 years and has been part of that whole kind of organic and agroecological market gardening movement in Canada, and has become quite successful at it. And with small grants and support, he's been able to develop a very well-structured and thought-through textbook around his experiences. Practical stuff around tools, rotations, greenhouse management, other things like that. As well as a series of online videos, short clips that people can access and read. So the fact that this single farmer in Canada came up as more influential to the knowledge kind of struggles of pioneering farmers in South Africa, at least the ones that I interviewed, who were kind of farming in a similar way to this kind of organic market gardening, came up as more influential than all of our state institutions combined, is it's a real, in some ways, it's quite a hopeful message. Because it says that with a relatively small amount of resources, you can actually make quite a big impact. Because he hasn't had a lot of, he's not a large institution. He still farms, he still supplies a market on a daily basis. And he now has a small team around him that helps him to support, running online courses and things. But I think this idea of supporting practitioners to become teachers and to take the knowledge that practitioners hold beyond the boundaries of their own time, I think is something which can really be, it's kind of, in some ways, it's a low-hanging fruit. And I think also, interestingly, I think we often think about apprenticeships on farms as a mode of training, and I think they're very, 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 very valuable, but they're also extremely limiting. And given how small the sector is at the moment and how, how the size of the need that we have, I think relying on this idea of farm apprenticeships as the kind of gold standard, while a gold standard it may be, we need to really move beyond that. So he, for example, only ever has 1 or 2 learners or interns on his farm at any one time. But if you sign up to one of his online, free online courses, there's 700 or 800 people at any time from all over the world. His book has been translated into 7 or 8 different languages. So if he can be as useful as someone who's farming in a freezing Canadian climate to South African farmers here, we have that knowledge in South Africa. There are people who know how to do this. We just haven't documented and told the stories in the same way. And as a result, farmers in our space are still turning to people in the north for this when I don't think they need to be. So what would it mean to translate this into South African languages? What would it mean to translate this to South African context, to deal with literacy, data access, all of that stuff? How do we unpack that? So that's kind of part of what I'm also working on at the moment at Rhodes. And then I think as I've spoken about already, I think this task demands the kind of the death of this idea of the farmer. And we need to be thinking less about the individual farmer and much more about building competency amongst farming families and farming communities. Yeah. So, kind of in summary, I think enough young people are interested to more than warrant substantial investment into the space, and I think narratives that young people aren't interested in agriculture are unfounded. And that, just if you were to extrapolate, well, my numbers weren't, really nationally representative. If you were to extrapolate those numbers, that, it would be far, far, far more young people than even the most ambitious targets of the National Development Plan could ever dream of meeting. So saying, there's more than enough interest in young people. Secondly, that their narratives, in a sense, provide a kind of powerful political mandate for a kind of wider food system transformation. And that also not to kind of lose this, the fact that for young people, it wasn't just about making a living. And I think often we frame responses to unemployment purely from a livelihoods and an income perspective. And while that's obviously extremely important to people, almost as important amongst a lot of the stories we were collecting was this idea of what it means to construct identity through work and how you find meaning in life. And that we need to be selling and promoting these two things hand in hand as we develop careers and career pathways for people. And that represents a real opportunity for supporting kind of wider, kind of more systemic just transitions and saying, well, actually, there's a foundation for this. Young people, if we were to support it in the right way and you can frame it in the right way, there's people who want to get involved in businesses, not just about profit. And that there's a really strong evidence for that. I think what was lacking, however, was that while young people seem to have a very, very strong kind of social orientation, the environmental interest was almost completely absent. So saying, okay, well, maybe there's also work to be done there. And then that's a space for further engagement. And then to say, I think meeting youth on these terms is not just about transforming the agricultural sector, and that really from what we saw from the net mapping and what influenced farmer success is that it's really not just about farming. It requires an entire shift along the value chain. And for these farms to work, the alternative retail sectors and processing and distribution systems also have to be working, as do the input sides. And I think that's the input side we don't often think about as much. Nursery production, seedling production, organic pest management approaches, and all the other things which come at the front or kind of downstream. And that I think we often try and teach farmers to try and do all of this themselves. Most farmers were saying, well, actually, we want to rely on others who can do that really well, and that we don't try and just be overburdened by trying to do everything. So saying, okay, well, if we're going to get that right, if we're going to make a space for young people, this whole space needs to be transformed, which is obviously a much, much bigger task. But in supporting us to do this, there are these pockets of the future which already exist now. But I think that they're often overlooked, and we're not really, from my perspective, leveraging the potential that these kind of pioneers in these pioneering spaces, who through their own kind of idealism, blood, sweat, and tears, have really been developing, what is in a sense the most cutting-edge research and knowledge around these issues. But knowledge is a major, major, major bottleneck. It's not the only bottleneck, but it's a really, really, really big one. And when you consider like the breadth in terms of the total number of people, if we're thinking about building up subsistence farmers into small livelihood farmers, there's 2 to 3 million subsistence farmers in this country. It's a huge, huge number of people to be working with. And the knowledge, the depth of the knowledge is also incredibly deep. And I think we underestimate how difficult it is. We consistently underestimate how difficult making a go of this in today's climate is. So that it's a very deep knowledge that needs to be transferred to a huge number of people from a platform of only a very, 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 very small handful of people actually knowing how to do that at present. And I think that combination is a very, very difficult one. And we need to, I think, work into a space where we're really kind of trying to catalyze that existing knowledge and exponentially increasing access to it. Yeah. I agonized about starting a PhD for maybe like 2 or 3 years before, and I had like so many proposals that I'd written. And so I think it took me a very, very long time to start. And I threw a lot of ideas out. But I feel that once I kind of made a decision and I started, it kind of flowed through. It flowed through quite coherently, and I think I was partly lucky with that. But I think it was also partly a factor of that I'd kind of chosen to work in a space that was that I really had kind of quite a wide network of established connections, and I had so getting access to interviews was never an issue for me. So like I think that really, really helped in terms of I didn't try and like go and study a hill tribe in Borneo. Like, so for me, I think that really helped simplify my process. So I think I was riding on a lot of work that I'd kind of been doing for the 7 years preceding my PhD, that I think really helped kind of smooth the process out. I think there's always so many directions you kind of think about that you want to go once you start digging into it. And I think that was, for me, was maybe the challenge was kind of keeping it narrow enough without becoming too broad that I was not actually really able to say anything. So I think that was maybe one of my bigger challenges. But yeah, I think I was also kind of quite lucky in that process, that I didn't hit too many kind of barriers along the way. And see, I don't know if there's anything you want to add, like kind of thoughts. Maybe I'm kind of overlooking stuff, but no, But so, I mean, like building on that, Megan, I think maybe like one of the dangers that I probably fell into it a bit was because I was so immersed in it, and in some ways, kind of just confirming my own assumptions. So I think if there was any like kind of trap that I feel I fell into in this process, it was that. Of having a narrative that I wanted to be true, and kind of falling into the trap of a kind of confirmation bias. I can maybe speak to some of the work that we're doing at the moment, which I think does in some ways respond to this in a practical sense. Is that I'm working with a group that has been setting up learning networks. The most established one of which is in the Eastern Cape, but also there's one in Mpumalanga in the Northwest. But really looking at how to not throw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of the agricultural colleges, but to think of ways, and also the state extension services, because so much money does go into those, but finding ways of building up networks at a community or kind of regional level around this, which are very inclusive, and kind of work with all the stakeholders, so farmers, extension workers, college faculty, to kind of codify areas of concern and then try and help broker a deepening of understanding around those issues in those contexts. So what Rhodes has been doing is developing kind of these course-activated networks, where they were working in areas that were saying, the messages coming out from people on the land was that water issues are a major challenge, and then saying, okay, well, setting up a university-accredited course in kind of rainwater harvesting and water management, which was then offered to farmers, it was offered to extension workers, it was offered to college faculty, and through the kind of practical work on those courses, networks and relationships were built and brokered in a local context, and skills were developed around a particular thing that now are, it started around a particular water issue, and now it's kind of growing into a much wider learning network into which various partners are starting to kind of support in and bring bits of information. But the network doesn't necessarily sit at a particular location or particular, space. So I think for me, there's stuff around how you build up these multi kind of stakeholder kind of co-learning networks. There's a really interesting space. I think also in terms of investment at a national level, I mean, I really, as I'd said with this, I think there's a lot of work to be done by universities in terms of documenting and helping to really tell the story and catalyze, kind of document the knowledge of people who've been doing this for a long time and investing in that. And getting the knowledge out of those heads and into the hands of more. But I think there's still a lot that needs to be worked out in terms of how that then translates out and how you get college faculty to kind of buy into the process of curriculum review at agricultural colleges, how you get, I think getting that information out to civil society organizations and other things, there's work that needs to be done around that, maybe a little bit easier. But I think it's, for me, the points of entry would be documenting farmer knowledge and experience and building curriculums up out of that, and investing more into understanding how you support these kind of learning networks at a regional level around issues. I mean, I think business, like, if I speak purely to my findings, business fits in on the side of inputs to farmers. And I don't mean it in that kind of inputs in the sense of like in the conventional way that you think of inputs, but like good quality seedlings, good quality compost. There's a lot of good quality irrigation systems. There are a lot of inputs that are still needed, and there's a lot of specialized knowledge around that. So I think there's a space for business there that's very valuable. And I think maybe also speaking to Mark's question, there's room to work with practitioners in those spaces to improve the way that they are also recognize that they're acting as teachers already, and in some ways and supporting and enhancing their ability to do that. I'm very, very skeptical of the large retail. I kind of think it's a write-off, and I think time spent trying to get into that is largely a waste of time. Not because I don't think it can work, but I think that like for the energy and effort that it requires to make something work, your energy is much better spent elsewhere. And I also just think like the two don't fit, and it's always going to be like philanthropy from the side of big retailers just because of how their business model is structured, and that the work needs to go into, rather than supporting smallholder supply to big retailers, is kind of supporting smallholder supply into alternative retail systems. And I think like we need to still see that alternative resale as the private sector, but that should be the focus of our attention. Yeah, I mean, I think from a learning approach perspective, there's a lot that's being done. In like research is coming out of UCL and things around social ecosystems of learning, particularly around vocational skills, is very much like at the forefront of kind of northern literature around education and the way that good education happens, particularly in the vocational skills space. So I think in that sense, like this is not a kind of second-rate solution in a sense. And then kind of to your point, maybe around the kind of relationship between small farmers and kind of GDP at a national level. I mean, I think it's a much longer road. And I think it's also about tapping into, I mean, economically, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that supporting family farming is a really, really good economic decision in the long run. But I think it's also to say that these are also issues that we can't afford not to be addressing from a kind of socio-political perspective in South Africa, from a kind of land reform perspective, from a youth unemployment perspective, and that those are also really, really powerful political drivers in South Africa, and that the narrative is about both. But I think that this idea of capital accumulation from below is something that's been written about a lot, but it's much harder to put into practice in the kind of global system as we have it. I mean, and I think that needs like those kind of arguments need to be built up. There's a level of social movement building that needs to come along with this. And I think that's also from our experience. Like developing a learning network is not just about the learning. It's about developing a network of solidarity. It's about developing a network that is not just mobilizing around practical issues of how to build a rainwater harvesting tank or like whatever. It's also around issues of when there's like land conferences coming up, when there are GMO like seed bills being passed. It's around it. It starts around a particular, and that's the great thing about these like kind of learning networks, and the genius of the course activated network is that it starts around something very practical and gets people working together around a practical issue. But I think if curated and managed well, grows into a much wider kind of network of social mobilization, which is really interesting. And is necessary, I think, in order to not end up with what you're talking about. And I think that's what's great about working with and building knowledge on the backs of successful farmers is that by default they have to have answered all of those questions, in a sense to have made it. They have to know, they have to have a market strategy, and I mean, so there's a lot of talk around public procurement in South Africa, but it doesn't really happen much. But it's definitely something which is mooted quite often. And I think within the learning network now, also there's a group within it which is very much asking questions around market access, and debating these very same issues around engagement with retailers or not. And if you don't, what's the alternative? Particularly in areas in South Africa that are very rural and have very little economic activity happening in the areas where farmers are based. So it's you're not in the kind of privileged position that you are in Canada, where you have a relatively middle class society, and you can kind of, even at small towns, you can set up markets. So it's kind of debating all of that stuff. So yes, it happens in the learning networks. So it's I think that conversation is very much, it's central. I mean, you can't neglect that side of it. But I'd be quite interested to hear how that, that the university you spoke about, how they set it up and some of those findings, if there was stuff that you had from that. I'd be interested to read it. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think I was very lucky to end up with a kind of opportunity for a postdoc in a space that lined up exactly with a lot of the stuff that I'd been talking about and I'd been working on. So I think it really opened up an avenue and an opportunity there that would not otherwise have been there. And so we've been working on this policy brief from one of the papers, or kind of from the PhD, and I was actually looking at the recommendations at the back and just thinking of like each of these four is actually met by the work that I'm engaging with in the moment, or we're actively working on each of these four things without the fact that I'd really, this was written before I started there. So I think it's really opened up a space for me to be engaging there. And, I think, there's also the stuff that we're doing around the Sensemaker stuff that is kind of growing and emerging. But I think also for me personally, I think it's also opened up more of a space for wanting to kind of valuing the kind of knowledge that comes from practice too. So at the same time as taking on the postdoc, trying to set up a farming business of my own, and recognizing that re-recognizing the value of that as a contribution to the kind of broader knowledge economy in a way. I mean, so I would agree with what you're saying. I think young people are leaving and they are turning their backs on it. And I suppose in some ways that's kind of part of what I was saying is that, and many people are leaving because they're just not interested, and there's other things that they're interested in, and there's also a lot that are leaving in spite of the fact that they're interested, because the farming options that they have available to them, whether it's in the Eastern Cape or if it's in Limpopo or wherever, do not really speak to the way that they want to be farming and the way that they want to be living their lives. So they don't have viable kind of present role models that prove to both them and their families and peers who are influential in their decisions that farming can be a viable and dignified livelihood where you can provide for your children and you can have a lot of the things that people taking on other jobs are achieving. They're still experiencing, I spoke about this idea of being trapped between these two forms of slavery in a sense. And so from a young people's perspective, so I would agree with you in a way, but to say that that's not just because young people aren't interested. It's also because the system doesn't make the kind of opportunities available to them that are interesting to them in the agricultural space. And if the system was different, we might see more people staying. So the learning network that I'm involved in is in the Eastern Cape. It's around Alice and Middle Drift area. And, that the most active members in that network are young people. And they're now, having been through training, they're setting up trainers programs for other youth and other schools and things. So there's kind of this forward play of stuff. So I think it's to acknowledge what you're saying, but to say that there's more. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a space where kind of everyone's trying to develop an app at the moment. And what I've seen both in the networks that I'm involved in as well as others kind of conferences I've been to is that so often a lot of time and energy is spent developing an app and everybody goes back to using WhatsApp. Because it's just the platform that people are familiar with, and tech literacy is low, and in networks having platforms which are shared across a lot of people, the broad usability of those platforms is really important. So I think there's definitely a space for it. And so Robin Murray, I think if you remember, who was at the SI, is now also doing work with I&J around kind of a digital TV station in which content is developed there for people at sea. And so I think there's the potential for apps, but and particularly kind of spanning the learning space maybe. But the data access is really a big issue for people, the cost of data, and that all the apps that I've seen developed so far, I mean, some of them kind of slowly take off, but largely people, I think for me what's more interesting is how you use WhatsApp and existing platforms more effectively, and how you tap in those kinds of supports saying, okay, well, how do you develop a soil testing system that is compatible with WhatsApp rather than developing a soil testing app? So saying, okay, well, do you like give people a printout template and that gives a color code, and then they then photo that and like send it to the group, and there's someone who looks at the color or the number on that chart and then interprets it like that, rather than trying to develop an app for it.